No matter what industry you work in, whether you've lost your job, are working from home, or have the kind of job where you can't stay home, every Canadian workplace has felt the effects of COVID-19. Among the hardest hit are meat processing plants, where outbreaks have infected hundreds of workers. It was so bad at some of the plants, they had to close. Meat processing is big business. About 65,000 people work in the industry in Canada. All the facilities now are back in operation with new safety measures in place, but the virus has sent a shudder through the industry. It is vulnerable, and so is our food supply. Is it time for a fundamental rethink of how it's structured? Heather Yourex-West is looking into that.
Me and my siblings keep saying that he was the best dad in the world because he truly was.
51-year-old Benito Quesada died from COVID-19 in hospital on May 7th, leaving behind a wife, 4 children, and an empty space that will never be filled.
We haven't touched anything of his. His boots are still there in the entryway. His toothbrush, his cologne, everything's still there.
Quesada worked at the Cargill meat packing plant in High River, Alberta. He took a $500 bonus to keep working after employees started to get sick. Soon, he was infected too, and for weeks he lay in a hospital ICU fighting for his life.
He's always strong. He's the one that protects us, and seeing him there super vulnerable, I had never seen him like that.
Quesada was the second worker at the Cargill plant to die of COVID-19. 67-year-old Hip Bowie passed away in April. The plant closed on April 20th after Bowie's death. In all, at least 943 Cargill employees tested positive, and more than 1,500 cases were linked to the plant. It was the largest outbreak from a single site in Canada. Meanwhile, there were 661 workers infected at the JBS beef plant in Brooks, Alberta, and one of those workers died. These plants are a perfect place for a virus to spread. They are cold, and most of them are laid out like this JBS plant in the United States, workers standing elbow to elbow on the cutting line. Unlike Cargill, the JBS plant in Alberta was never shut down because of the outbreak, but it did scale down operations, cutting production to just 1 shift a day. It's now back to running 2 shifts of workers, but inside it is far from business as usual. That's because until there's a vaccine, both the company and its workers are very aware that another outbreak could happen at any time.
So they've introduced PPE so that people are wearing masks and visors. They've put plastic barriers between individual people working in the plant in order to reduce the flow of air between individuals. They've staggered people's start and finish times. They've staggered breaks to reduce the density. They've put dividers in buses and increased the number of buses.
So far, those measures seem to be working. As of this week, there were only 2 active cases among workers at Cargill and JBS, and no new outbreaks have been reported. But some workers still don't feel safe.
Actually, I have friends, they still stay in the house now. They said that, no, I don't want to go back because we're scared.
Remilyn Bi tested positive for COVID-19 in late April, even though she had no symptoms. The single mom returned back to work at JBS last week. She says she feels safe, but she knows many of her co-workers have been reluctant to return. For an industry that was facing a labor shortage before this pandemic, that's a big problem.
It's one of the reasons we have often new immigrants working in these plants, because they're not jobs that everybody wants. So even before the risk of infection through COVID, which we've now reduced, these plants often had trouble filling jobs.
As meat processors inch back towards full production, balancing worker safety and profitability will become more difficult. But it also may not be possible to keep workers physically distant in existing factories. That could mean higher meat prices for Canadians in the short term. But in the long term, the Canadian Meat Council says there may be bigger changes coming.
What I said to a few people in government is what the plants look like pre-COVID are not what they look like currently, and I don't think that's what the plants will look like post-COVID. What I do think it has done is advance the discussion of whether or not you would want to look at having more automation in your plants. And I think on balance, Most of the plants are looking at that at some level.
This might be a sneak peek at the future. At this pork plant in Denmark, machines do much of the cutting that humans do in North America.
Tyson's always been a company that's been out on the forefront of innovation.
Just last year, U.S. meat processing giant Tyson Foods opened this sparkling new facility in Arkansas to develop new technology, automating many of its production processes. And in 2015, JBS bought Scott Technologies, a New Zealand company that specializes in robot butchers.
We developed the world's first lamb X-ray primal and middle system.
This promotional video from here at the JBS lamb processing plant in Australia shows how the company uses sophisticated technology like artificial intelligence to automate some meat-cutting jobs that humans used to do.
It does that by X-raying every animal as an individual animal and identifying where the fourth and fifth rib are and where that hindquarter cut is. And that's the whole purpose of that X-ray primal machine.
X-rays and CT scanners are used to create a 3D model of the shape and size of the carcass before the cutting starts. Scott Technologies claims this results in 90% accuracy. The machines are also faster, and over time, these robot butchers keep getting better at their job. And unlike humans, they don't get sick or injured, and they don't need breaks or benefits. The technology has already significantly reduced the number of workers on the cutting lines. Automation could make meat plants much safer when the next virus hits. It could also mean fewer jobs. But as the Quesada family tries to find small moments of joy without their husband and father, they're not thinking about that now.
My family is devastated, and this time is very hard every day. Every day is very hard.
They're just trying to come to terms with the loss.
With me from Fort Collins, Colorado, is Temple Grandin. She's a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. She's an author, inventor, lecturer, and designer of livestock handling facilities all over North America. Her thinking process is based more on visual images than words, and her autism gives her a unique ability to understand how animals see the world, and her skills have helped meat processors and slaughterhouses handle animals in a more humane way. And she's a female trailblazer in a mostly male industry. Temple Grandin, thanks for joining us. Given what you know about meat processing plants, how many people work there, how closely they work, the hundreds of workers who have become sick with COVID-19, what grade do you give the industry for how it's responded to the pandemic?
Well, they've actually worked hard to respond to it. COVID attacks where people are crammed together, whether it's cruise ships, prisons, aircraft carriers, any place where they're together. And actually, the plants seem to be recovering now. I just talked to 2 pork plants 2 days ago, and they tested everybody in the plant, and there were many positives, but the interesting thing is that half of those positives had no symptoms. So something's going on here with the virus. But the virus attacks people that are indoors, close together, no matter where it is.
Yeah, there's so many unanswered questions still about how this virus spreads and how it's transmitted. Meat processing, I know you know, has changed so much in the last few decades. You've been a part of that. It's also become so centralized in these big factories that process, I think, 2,000 to 6,000 cattle a day in some cases, as many as 20,000 pigs a day. Have they become too big to be resilient?
That's a problem, but the problem of big is fragile is not just meat. It's also the semiconductor industry. It's also the pharmaceutical industry. In semiconductors, we rely on 3 factories in the world for the heart of your computer, the heart of your phone, pharmaceuticals, raw materials coming from China and India, common generic drugs. Container ships are now infected. That's like 80% of all our trade. Big is fragile. Now, the thing about big is it's very efficient. Large meatpacking plant can do really good animal welfare. It can do really good food safety. But when it breaks, you've got real big problems in the supply chain. Big is fragile. It's very cost effective, very economical. A more distributed supply chain will not get disrupted, but it's going to cost more. I don't care if it's meat or whether it's semiconductors or whether it's pharmaceuticals.
Just looking specifically at the meat industry for a moment, though, what role do you think automation should or could play in the future to, I guess, eliminate some of the fragility, at least from a human perspective?
Well, some of the jobs are difficult to automate. Automation is easy when you have like a part that you're making that every one of them is exactly the same. Animals have got biological variability. Now, big is fragile for other reasons too. Storms, natural disasters, war, possibly, is another thing that makes big is fragile.
So what do you think, you're so good at analyzing systems, what do you think a possible solution is now? Is it sort of breaking down these huge, let's look at meat processing specifically, breaking down these huge processors into smaller players across the country the way it used to be?
Well, I think what's happening is is similar to the beer market. You know, right here in Fort Collins where I live, we got the great big Coors plant, but then you have all these little tiny craft breweries. And I think it's going to be more local things like this. Well, when I first went in the industry in Arizona, we had our two big ones. They were Cudahy and Swifts. And then we had a bunch of what I call medium-sized plants. So we had Arizona Beef, we had Hearst's. Arizona Beef might do 400 cattle a day. It was not a locker plant. But all the other smaller plants are maybe 1/3 of the beef supply. Now those little plants, the smaller plants they couldn't compete with the big guys. So what's happened in other industries like beer, for example, is you don't try to compete with the big guys. You do something that's special.
So if there are microbreweries now that are doing very well, you're suggesting micro meat processing?
Well, that's actually, some of this is starting to happen. In fact, I went to New Zealand 2 years ago, and they have rather small plants. They call them boutique plants, and they'll put out very specific orders, 100 boxes of some special cut to send to Japan, for example.
So if we want meat processing that is both humane as possible for the animals and safe as possible for the human workers, do you think we're going to have to prepare to pay more for meat?
Big concentrated supply chains are fragile. The paradox is, big is very efficient. Big can do a really good job. Food safety, animal welfare, whatever, but it's fragile. And if you go to a more distributed supply chain, it's going to be less prone to disruption. I don't care what product it is, but it's going to cost more. That's the paradox. I don't care what product it is. Meat, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical supply chain. The really big example of big is fragile.
Just one more question about the industry. I know you're closely connected to the meat industry. Do you think they have a handle now on the spread of COVID-19, or do you think we might continue to see outbreaks in these processing plants?
I think the plants have got a handle on it now. We're going to get outbreaks. What's going to happen in the restaurants? Who knows? That's a bigger worry right now than the plants. I think that's gotten under control there. The weekly slaughter rates are going back up. That's a very good sign that they have a handle on it. I'm looking at my cattle buyers weekly, and they said that the capacity of the plants, they're ramping it up. That means they're getting it under control. Some of these plants got down to half capacity. You know, now the industry's running about 80, 90% now. That's actually good.